Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to RMA OC's first event of the fiscal year featuring Brian Calle, founder and CEO of LA Weekly. While it looks much different than what we'd have at the Pacific Club, we also, While it looks much different than how we'd see at the Pacific Club, the RMA OC board is dedicated to bringing you meaningful and relevant content. We hope you continue to follow RMA OC and continue to join us in future webinars as we navigate these uncertain times. My name is Chris Nommensen, Vice President of Camel Financial and Vice Chair to the RMA OC Board. I'll be your host for this event, and we'll try to keep all recognitions quick so that we can get to the presentation. Like any organization, we are made strong by our supporters. Please join me in recognizing our platinum sponsors. These organizations benefit from the knowledge and networking of RMA OC and significantly contribute to the great programming we provide. I'd also like to recognize our gold sponsors as well. These aren't nearly at the level as the platinum, but they still are involved in either serving in board positions or helping promote our affinity groups from around the area. If you have any interest in joining as a sponsor, please contact Vicky Philippi with her contact information below. Now, one of the things about being a platinum sponsor, which is great, is the fact that you are designated to be an event sponsor. During this time, we get to promote your business specifically on various avenues to promote. So in this case, White Nelson, along with Union Bank, is our sponsors. White Nelson is more than just a tax firm. They offer accounting, advisory services, and the like. White Nelson leads the way in providing businesses and its owner with the guidance and insight needed to produce real growth. Founded in 1927, White Nelson's knowledge has been built upon nearly a century of experience. They know how to grow businesses, consult with and audit those businesses, improve operations, and deliver strategies to reduce tax liabilities. They know how to deliver solutions. White Nelson is the premier public accounting firm in Orange County and has been and continues to be a proud sponsor of RMA Orange County. For more information, please contact Greg via email or phone. Our next sponsor is Union Bank. Union Bank has been a proud sponsor of the RMA National since 1958 and a platinum sponsor of the Orange County chapter for over 10 years. Union Bank is a member of MUFG, which is among the world's largest leading financial groups. With approximately 360 years of history, MUFG's global network has around 2,700 offices and 50 markets with over 180,000 employees. If you'd like to know more about the commercial lending services provided in the area, please reach out to Craig Sandberg directly, either through LinkedIn or via email. And now on to our main event. I'd like to introduce Brian Calle. Having predicted the Trump victory during his October 2016 presentation, why Donald Trump shouldn't win and will, Brian Calle has been met with disapproval from both ends of the political spectrum. During his tenure, Orange County Register readers claim that the editorial board has now fallen into liberal progressive trap and predicted more progressively liberal positions on social issues. While LA Weekly critics now claim that Calle is the right-wing ideologue with the mission to slowly but surely pitch the Weekly to the right and, quote, have every reason to believe he's somehow more conservative than his career suggests. Today, you'll hear exactly where he stands. So thank you today for joining RMA OC for an insider's view of the most highly anticipated elections in history. Brian, are you able to access the mic?
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello?
I don't know if we're able to hear you.
Yeah, I can hear him. I can.
Yeah?
Good.
I can hear him.
Are we good or no?
We're good.
You're good to go, Brian. You're
Okay.
good to go.
I'm going to say that it is literally my favorite introduction ever, because I think it's both accurate and funny, because for me that means that I piss off people on the left and I piss off people on the right, which means I'm in the exact right place in the center where I like to be. And that's just because I am convicted in my convictions and I believe what I believe. And, you know, I think that more and more Americans believe and are coming from a place that I see myself at. But super excited to be back here. I can't believe that it's been 4 years. I'm having a bad hair day, and some COVID weight, but you know, get over it. But yeah, so I can't believe it's been 4 years, because life goes so fast and changes. And I remember 4 years ago, I was running editorial content for 11 newspapers, including the OC Register, and now I'm CEO of LA Weekly, running the business side, still involved in editorial, but really focused on the business side of our businesses, LA Weekly, Irvine Weekly, and beyond. So it's fun to be able to talk about politics. I stay informed, I stay very active, and am very interested and horrified often these days when looking at some of the political developments. Even if you would have asked me 4 years ago, after Trump wins, what would happen? I would have predicted some of these things, but certainly not all of them. It's been a wild ride. And interestingly enough, I think it's going to be an even wilder ride as we get into the November 3rd election and beyond the election. And for those of you who were part of the presentation 4 years ago, and I gave this presentation at USC and a few other places, what I said.
Hey, Steve Castleberry in Orange County. I'm trying to get on a Zoom call and I can't get any.
So I love these are the fun times of COVID technology. So 4 years ago, I gave the speech a lot of different places when I was one of the few pundits that said, well, I don't think Trump should win the election. He will win the election. And people always ask me, why I wouldn't vote for Trump or why I wouldn't support Trump. And I said I wouldn't support Hillary either, but I often said I wouldn't vote for Trump because I'm half Latino and my ex is Muslim. And if Trump were elected, he would send me back to Mexico and put my ex in jail. And I'm fine with my ex going to jail, just not for his religion. And so I held firm to that. And I still won't be voting for Trump in this particular election. I don't think I'll be voting for Joe Biden either, but I did vote for him in the primary, so we'll see what will happen. But with that said, I don't want to give a very long presentation because I think that a lot of people have questions, and that makes this way more fun for me to be able to answer questions than to kind of talk at you for a half an hour or longer, because I could listen to my voice all day. But I'll give you a couple of insights which I think are interesting. So in the 2016 election, what led me to my belief that Trump was going to win and defeat Hillary Clinton, which he did, was that there was a canvassing report that was conducted by the SEIU union in the Rust Belt of the US. And that SEIU report said that the #1 choice of union Democrats in the Rust Belt was Donald Trump. Now that data point alone would lead people to believe that Trump had a very good chance of winning, but that wasn't enough for me to believe, okay, this guy's probably gonna win. What helped me get to the place where I thought that he was going to win, and invariably he did by winning the Rust Belt, was that when the SEIU repolled Bernie Sanders voters, because in that same poll, it was Trump #1 for Union Democrats and Bernie Sanders #2 for Union Democrats. When they repolled the Bernie Sanders voters and they said, if Bernie Sanders isn't on the ballot in November, who is your second choice for president? And overwhelmingly, it was Donald Trump. So Donald Trump was effectively the first and second choice for Union Democrats in the Rust Belt, which is invariably how he won the election. And that was enough of a data point to tell me that Democrats were in serious trouble. This election is very different. And I think that if we were having this conversation in, say, December or January, I'd probably have a different outlook on things because the economy was humming along. And it's very difficult, regardless of what else is going on and how fast a president might be, that if the economy is doing as well as it was, that the president's going to be reelected. Obviously, COVID-19 has really thrown a wrench into that. So trying to do any kind of political predictions or political analysis is incredibly troubling. And I think that, interestingly enough, that in some ways, unfortunately, because it shouldn't have been, COVID has become a political or partisan issue, where if you're on the left and you're progressive and you're a Democrat, you have one set of feelings about the pandemic. If you are on the right, you're conservative and you're a Republican, you have different feelings about the pandemic, which causes some very interesting calculus. And also there's a disconnect between, I think, West Coast and East Coast beliefs and feelings about COVID, and certainly Northern America and Southern America as well. So it really complicates the messaging and the campaigning and the tactics. And I think you'll see both Republicans and Democrats using different talking points depending on where they are in the country, which is particularly interesting. I think that what will further complicate matters is that the group of Americans who are most concerned or fervently concerned with COVID-19 typically are older Americans, and for good reason, because it's hit the elderly a little bit harder, and people with a lot of it harder, and those with pre-existing conditions. And in many of the swing states, particularly in the Rust Belt, that Trump needs to win the election, he's going to need to count on the turnout of older, retired voters. In some states, I think he's seeing a challenge in that regard. In other states, he's looking better. For example, I think he's looking really good in Florida. In Wisconsin, he has an interesting, he'll have an interesting road. It looks a lot more difficult. And Ohio, which has been one of the states to decide the presidency for a long time, the Trump campaign is all but sure that they're going to win Ohio. What I think that the election will ultimately come down to in terms of the two states to watch on election night, and really beyond election night, because with mail-in ballots and absentee voting and everything, and the amount of people who will actually turn out, I think that we won't know the results of the election on election night. That's my sense. Obviously, I could be wrong. But I think the two states to watch most closely are Michigan. I would say actually three states. I would say Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. I think those three states will ultimately decide whether we have President Biden or a second term of President Trump. And I think one that's very, very interesting that people don't talk about very much these days is Minnesota. In the 2016 election, the Trump campaign and Republicans wrote off Minnesota. They actually thought that they were going to lose in the state of Minnesota. In fact, they only had one campaign staffer in Minnesota for the presidential election. One person. And Democrats had droves of people campaigning and canvassing in Minnesota. In the last few weeks, or maybe even a month before the election, they pulled that one staffer and they moved them, I think it was to Wisconsin or to Ohio, I can't remember the exact one. Excuse me. And interestingly enough, even with having pulled out of Minnesota, even with having no campaign staff there and very little money spent by the Republicans in Minnesota, Trump only lost Minnesota by 1.5 points, which means that Republicans are looking at Minnesota as a tremendous opportunity. What it makes Minnesota more interesting, I think, and crucial when you look at the election as well, is you also have had a large reaction to the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. You've had many of the protests in the country start in Minnesota. So you're having this kind of meeting of both the civil unrest and the presidential election in Minnesota, which will probably be one of the deciding factors in who is elected the next president of the United States. And just as an interesting tidbit about Minnesota, as a student of history, when Ronald Reagan ran for re-election, he won 49 states in the United States, I think. Minnesota was the only one that Ronald Reagan did not win when he ran for re-election, which I believe would have been in '84 because I was 3 years old. Interesting tidbit. Minnesota is and that's where they had Al Franken and Jesse the Body Ventura as governor. So a very interesting state when it comes to politics. So it'll be very interesting to watch there. Similarly, I think that Pennsylvania and Michigan are also incredibly important on the watch list. I think that if you look at the policies that the president has enacted over the last 4 years, many of them were geared towards, maybe appeasing is the wrong word, but certainly appealing to the voters who were Rust Belt Union working voters in whether it be Minnesota, Pennsylvania, or Michigan. And I saw a question come through about whether the shutdowns and the strict shutdowns in those states are going to be impactful. And I think that that's what's going to make this such a close election, which is that the president has very strong followings in those communities that aren't typically Republican followings or leanings in those communities, coupled with a frustration over the shutdown and the lockdown, which puts him in a position, I think, a favorable position. Also, when you look at many of the polls, the national polls are showing Trump's down. Of course, Trump's going to be down because I'll tell you this, the one thing I'm very comfortable predicting is he's not going to win the popular vote. He didn't win the popular vote 4 years ago. He certainly isn't going to win the popular vote again, but we don't elect a president of the United States in America based on the popular vote. In the states that will ultimately decide who will become the president of the United States, in those states, Trump is either within the margin of error. I think in Minnesota, it's 1 or 2 points either way, with former Vice President Joe Biden. But in many of the polls, he's doing better than he did at the same equivalent time 4 years ago against Hillary Clinton. Now, many would believe that that means that Trump's probably ahead of the game, because I think there is a Trump polling syndrome, whereas if a pollster comes to your house or a pollster calls you and you're a Trump supporter, there's no way in hell that you're going to say that you're a Trump supporter, because Trump is such a polarizing and divisive figure that most people who support him, maybe not most, but a lot of people who support him aren't going to be comfortable saying in public, let alone to a stranger on the phone who might know where they live, that they're supporting Donald Trump. So a lot of people are using that data to believe that Trump's probably in the driver's seat in terms of being ahead as of now in some of the crucial states that matter. But what people also forget is that Joe Biden's favorable ratings among folks are much better than Hillary Clinton's. The one thing that Trump had that was going for him in the political election of 2016 was that Hillary Clinton's unfavorables were so high, and so many people had a bad perception of her that them not voting was effectively in those places of vote for Trump. Now, is that same phenomenon going to happen in 2020? Because people don't have the same, disdain, let's call it, for Joe Biden as they did for Donald Trump. So with all of those things mixed together, we were already going to have an incredibly interesting, provocative, and scary election season. But then last Friday, sadly, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, that threw an additional, I think, firework, I won't even call it a wrench, certainly a firework into the presidential election, because now the calculus in Washington, D.C. is whether or not the Republicans should or should not appoint and confirm a new Supreme Court justice to fill RBG's place on the Supreme Court. And Mitch McConnell, the leader of the US Senate, has already said Republicans are going to absolutely do that. Trump has said the same. A couple of the Republicans, one in particular who's in a swing state, said she will not vote prior to the election. But the interesting calculus now, I think, from both the Trump campaign, the president himself, and Mitch McConnell, is they're going to go through with the vote. But the question is, do they go through with the vote prior to the election or after the election? And that is probably going to have a unique, interesting impact on informed voters, and particularly, I think, the donor class, in terms of how much money they're going to put in to this race on top of what they were already planning to put in. I think personally that the Supreme Court nomination, whether it happens or not, probably will have less of an impact on the presidency than a lot of people think, because I think only like maybe half of Americans, or less than, I think it was 37%, maybe 38% I read, actually know that there are 9 members of the Supreme Court. So if only, a plurality of our country know that, or a third of our country, a little over a third of our country know that, does that really impact the electorate and this election in particular? I think what it's more likely to do is have a tremendous impact on the US Senate race, because people know that whichever Senate is going to go and be sworn in might had the opportunity to appoint a Supreme Court justice. So with all that said, I don't want to be too boring, because I can go into the weeds forever, because I'm a little bit wonky when it comes to that. But I would rather answer any questions you have, and if there's any other data I can share or anecdotal stories, I'm happy to do it. Should I just look in the chat box? Excuse me. Well, I'll just go through some of the questions that are coming in the chat. I don't know if you're going to do questions via chat or if you're going to do questions live. Either way, I don't care. But in the 3 states that I mentioned, do you see backlash against the draconian shutdowns will help Trump? I think that, again, the shutdowns have become in many ways partisan. If you're on the left, you feel one way. If you're on the right, you feel another way. I think that some data is suggesting, and polling data is suggesting, that older Americans are, like I said earlier, more concerned about the pandemic and probably support the shutdowns a little bit more. But if you're not in that category, and especially if you're an independent voter or declined to state, you are probably starting to get what I would call shutdown fatigue. And I think that there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in terms of the economy, jobs, and I think that whichever candidate pitches a more hopeful reopening strategy in many of those states, and reopening really meaning going back to work strategy, I think they'll have a better time. I think that if you're Trump, you can easily make the case reopen, because he didn't want to close down anything to begin with. With Joe Biden, if you're trying to position yourself as the more reasonable of the two, if you're trying to position yourself as the quote unquote adult in the room, it's a really fine line you have to walk to say, yes, we're going to reopen, but we still need to stay closed too. And I think that's a hard message to take to the voters, but can be done. But I also think that, something I've been saying a lot to my friends when we talk politics is that I actually think, not to at all discredit the long history of success in elective office that Joe Biden has had and his legacy in both the United States Senate and as a vice president. But this election really isn't about Joe Biden. It's Trump versus Trump in many ways. And so the question in my mind really becomes, can Trump contain himself for the next several weeks leading up to the presidential election enough to get over the hump? Or is he going to do something that puts him in a situation where he can't recover? And the challenge with Trump is, and many people said that Reagan was the Teflon president because nothing could stick to him. In many ways, if Reagan was the Teflon president, maybe Trump is the Iron Man president, because whether it's impeachment or every nonsensical thing that he says on Twitter or accusations of sexual assault, the guy just seems to get past every single one of them. So, while a subset of Americans, a large subset of Americans do hate Trump, hate Trump, his supporters are pretty enthusiastic about him. So it's just a very weird and fascinating thing to watch. Glenn has a question. If you look at the map of, and Chris, you can tell me if you want to ask these questions.
You're all good, man. Sorry, I had some muting.
If you look at the map of New York in the 2016 election, Trump won many areas around the state, but the New York City area went for Hillary, where there are obviously a lot of voters. New York City is not doing well right now under de Blasio. Do you think that could move the needle enough toward Trump for him? Or do you think it unthinkable to win in New York? New Yorkers are a different breed, could be a wild card. Absolutely not. I would bet my house and probably my entire net worth that there is no way in hell that New York is going to vote for Trump. Glenn, to send you to send you one flare that supports kind of at least somewhat of your theory. I don't know if you saw this a few weeks ago, but for the first time, I think ever, the New York City Police Union, and New York is arguably the top 3 most progressive cities in the country. I would say San Francisco is probably the top, maybe 4, and then, well, depending on, let's say large cities. New York is certainly top 3, but I'd say San Francisco is 1, and LA and New York probably vacillate. For the New York Police Union to come out and endorse Trump with Trump present was a very large political statement. But the core of New York is one that is overwhelmingly progressive and democratic. So I think I do think it's unthinkable that Trump would win in the city of New York. I mean, you have to take into consideration that New York is a city that had the opportunity to have a huge Amazon presence and opted not to do that, in many ways kind of pushed them out. And where de Blasio, who is one of the most progressive mayors in the country, remains seemingly popular for now, and not to mention AOC. So I think it would be difficult for a Republican to win an election in New York. Mail-in ballots. Given your assessment that turnout of older retired voters will be essential for Trump to win in some states, Wouldn't mail-in ballots be a boost for that campaign versus a detriment? Great question. So it's interesting, right? Because if you do polling or you look at the electorate, and I'm going to get these percentages a little bit off, but Republicans overwhelmingly, like 70% or something like that, prefer to go to a polling place to vote. I think Peggy Noonan did a piece on this in the Wall Street Journal recently, with some good data as well. So you can check my math there, but it was something like that. Similarly, Democrats prefer the opposite, which is 40% prefer going to the polls, and the rest prefer mail-in ballots of some sort. Much like everything in our country today, whether you vote by mail or not is a hyper-partisan issue. I think given this particular election, that to your point, mail-in ballots probably help Republicans, because there's a lot of older Republicans who don't want to go to the polls, so they'll need a vehicle to vote. Also, one of the interesting parts, which is kind of tangential to this, is that since schools are out of session in certain areas that are key swing states or swing districts, oftentimes the areas in and around a university tend to be very progressive and go overwhelmingly for the Democratic candidate. For example, 2 years ago, when Congresswoman Katie Porter wasn't yet a congresswoman, she was running for that seat against then Congresswoman Mimi Walters. The UC Irvine precinct went 91% for Katie Porter, 91% to 9 to Katie Porter. And some of you are like, well, how many people are in that precinct? Well, enough to make up that precinct alone in the entire district for Katie Porter now, made up over half of her entire voting margin to win that seat. So I think she won by like 10 or 11,000 votes, and she won that district by like 6 or something thousand votes. So I think that the schools being in or out of session is going to have a tremendous effect. And I bring up that story not to dodge your question in any way, but to suggest that even Democrats, who are much better at voter turnout, I think, than Republicans in terms of walking precincts and getting out the vote and collecting ballots from people and sending them in, are going to have a tougher time doing this. So it might, in certain areas, be helpful to Trump. Because if you think about it, if I'm going to mail in my ballot and I'm really concerned about COVID, if you come to my door, I'm going to be pissed at you. So I'm like, why are you here? Why aren't you wearing a mask? Get the hell off my property. I don't want any cooties right now. So I think that, that one could cut both ways. The reason it's become partisan is, and now I'm going off on a tangent a little bit, but I think it's just interesting context, is that Republicans, and it was something that happened for years when I was at the OC Register, are convinced that Democrats are stealing elections and that mail-in ballots and ballot collections are ripe with voter fraud. And there are anecdotal evidence. There's like a story here, or a friend of mine had 3 ballots mailed to her house and stuff like that. But the problem is there's been no really credible third-party deep investigation that produced substantial results that proved that, like, yes, there was enough voter fraud to create a different outcome in a particular election, other than some anecdotes. And then I think there was a recent documentary on some that had more anecdotal evidence, but not deep kind of dive into investigating if there's a substantial enough amount to have true impacts on the election. Interestingly enough, which is why this election is really scary, you've had Republicans saying that for a long time, and Donald Trump says it from his Twitter account, and he talks about it in public oftentimes too. So you have, Republicans in their way calling into question the legitimacy of elections throughout the country, and particularly, possibly in this election cycle, the presidential election. Interestingly enough, for the first time in the last several years, you have Democrats now doing the same thing, claiming that Republicans are trying to game the system, whether it's with the post office or whether it's with whatever mail-in ballot operations they have in other states. And then also, of course, with Russian interference that was aimed allegedly at swaying the presidential election. So that's a scary phenomenon, because now you have 2 major parties that have credible people on both sides saying or suggesting at least that the credibility of our election system is being undermined, which makes it really difficult, regardless of if it's Trump or Biden being elected, that the country unifies and accepts the results as being credible. And that's, you know, a longer discussion, but also very scary. Have I missed it, or I had to step away for a quick call? Do you have an ultimate prediction on who will win the election? I knew someone was going to ask this one. You know, I wouldn't bet much on it, but if I had to say today who I think would win the election, based on where polling is in the Rust Belt, based on, I think, the campaign tactics that are being deployed by both campaigns, I think that Trump is in a slightly better place to win than Biden, but I would say very slightly. So that would be my prediction for right now. But I reserve the right to change that prediction at some point. And like I said, I will not be voting for him. Scott Jones, I've heard that a large percentage of the 2006 Trump voters cited Supreme Court appointments as their #1 reason for voting for Trump. Many, despite other Trump qualities they find unfavorable. Based on this, doesn't it seem that the current situation has potential impact? I think it most certainly has a potential impact, but going back to what I was saying earlier, is that the vast majority of voters who go to the polls, or in this case, vote by mail, they're not that deep into American politics, nor do they necessarily understand the consequential nature of Supreme Court justices. So I think that elections, like the presidential election and some of the Senate elections as well, are for the most part decided at the margins. And they're decided by people who live their lives, and politics isn't something that they read about every day and isn't something that they follow on a weekly or daily basis. And so they don't really know if, you know, a Supreme Court nominee is gonna, you know, be good for them or bad for them. And I think that that with informed voters in the donor class, most certainly that's going to have a impact, but not on, I think, voters who have lives and don't necessarily have the time or interest to follow these things. To your point about the polling, it's interesting. One of the things I said in 2016, because people would always, when I would say that Trump was going to win, they were like, well, the polls say, and Hillary's overwhelmingly winning the polls. I would always say, well, these are national polls, one. But two, if you think about the types of people who were often polled, they're not the type of people that elected Trump in 2016. It's not the rural counties or the rural voters. I think in this particular election, some pollsters and news organizations recognize that, so they're doing a better job of scouting out the districts and the congressional districts that and areas that will ultimately make impactful decisions on who the next president will be. But oftentimes those polls are, I don't want to say filled with people who are elite, but certainly not a very good cross-section or diverse look into the minds of many voters, which is why all but I think literally in the last presidential election, all but one poll predicted that Trump would win. And I think that one poll was a USC LA Times poll that literally, excuse my French, every other news outlet and commentator shit on as not being credible at the time. Spencer has a question. It could be, or that was private, so never mind, it wasn't Spencer. It could be said that the stability bolsters the incumbency. It appears with much of what's going on that there are many that would seek to fan the flames of outrage and vulnerability in order to change the status quo. As you say, events such as the pandemic have become politicized to me in a disappointing way. Post-election, do you see the pandemic relief efforts shifting to a more realistic and less partisan strategy? What we have now seems intentionally inefficient in many ways. Both parties are manipulating the crisis for the benefit of instead of dealing with it in total war style. I agree. Not a beer, this is a Perrier. Although I would like a beer right now. I completely agree with your concerns. And actually, I think one of the most disgusting things is that, like, in everything in America today is part of the culture war. Nothing, we can't unify on anything. Everything is either left or right, conservative or liberal, and it's really unfortunate and certainly disgusting. A lot of people believe that after the election, that the pandemic efforts will unify, and that it'll become a less partisan issue. I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think that if I'm going to use California as an example, if you're Gavin Newsom and you're looking at the potential for Trump to be reelected, and you think the contrast between you and Trump is obviously your progressive worldview, but also you believe that the most important thing is how you handled the pandemic, then the pandemic in many ways still has to be partisan, for you to show that you were more responsible, and that gives you the credibility to be president of the United States. Because if you were president of the United States, then 200,000 people wouldn't have lost their lives. So I think if Trump's reelected, there is still going to be politics around the pandemic, most certainly. Unfortunately, I think that if Trump is not elected or reelected and Joe Biden is the president of the United States, that you'll see the counter of that, which is you'll see people who are very prominent Republicans who are saying, look at me in Florida, our economy is doing well, we're open and we're healthy, and you're killing the recovery for the entire country, Joe Biden. So unfortunately, I think that the politics of the pandemic will continue on well into the next year or two. And unfortunately, you're seeing a lot of experts and you're seeing a lot in the political class who are saying that things aren't going to resume to any sense of almost normalcy until mid-2021 or late 2021. So people are already spouting that. And I think there are some theories that, okay, if Trump doesn't win, and this is all going to go away and the world is going to, kumbaya. But I just don't know how realistic that actually is, unfortunately. And it's a really sad criticism of where American political and civic life is today, that even on what should be a time when Congress and the Senate and Republicans and Democrats elected to office come together, because these things aren't that complicated. We've seen countries that have handled the pandemic very well. We've seen states that have, who were able to keep open their economies while at the same time taking precautions to limit the spread of COVID. It's unfortunate, but I think the politics around it will continue for the foreseeable future, which is a bummer, but the reality, I think, of where we're at today. Helena says, do you think that Trump might win, but Republicans lose the Senate, making his second term lame duck? I think if Trump heard you call him a lame duck, he would have something to say about that. I'm fine calling him a lame duck, but it's really interesting. If I had to, again, predict, I would say that he'd probably win the presidency and the Republicans lose the Senate. Interestingly enough, some suggest that if Trump is able to win the presidency, that he'll pull up with him enough U.S. senators for Republicans to hold the Senate. It could very well end up being, which would be even crazier, but hey, it's 2020, a 50-50 Senate, where the vice president then, in one case Mike Pence, in another case Kamala Harris, would be the deciding vote for many of the votes in the U.S. Senate, which would not, I don't think in either case would be a good thing, because it shows that we're still a pretty divided country. But I do think that there is a case to be made that the Republicans lose the U.S. Senate. But if that's the case, and the Republicans lose the U.S. Senate, and the most important thing that many of, I think, elite level Republicans who follow these things care about is the Supreme Court. if there's already a supermajority on the Supreme Court in terms of court appointments, and I don't think that the Democrats could pack the court without a president appointing potential nominees, you know, at that point, it's kind of a stalemate. And then you'd have to see if Democrats in both the House and, excuse me, Senate could come to terms with enough compromise to make policy decisions. Because if that, you know, if that doesn't happen, we're going to be in a scary position as a country. But I don't know that, I'm pretty certain that Democrats wouldn't have enough of a majority in both houses of Congress to overturn presidential vetoes, which would create an even more polarizing situation in Washington, D.C. So I think it's very likely that Trump wins and then the Republicans lose the Senate. But I think it could be super, super interestingly close, and could even be a 50-50. In fact, I'd probably say, like, I'm at 40% Democrats winning, 35%, you know, Republicans holding the Senate, and then 25%, I think the math works out, you guys, many of your accountants, that it's a split US Senate, which would favor whoever wins the presidency. And then there's a couple other questions, but I'm gonna skip to the most recent one just because it's on topic. What's your prediction with the House? I think Democrats keep the House. I don't think that there's a good chance for Republicans to win it. Some people have tried to convince me of that there's gonna be this big red wave and that, you know, Trump is gonna help carry the House back. I just don't see that in the numbers, and I don't really, you know, my gut tells me that's probably not the case. You're welcome, Spencer. I appreciate that. And Trisha, are you willing to comment on why you will not vote for Trump? Well, I kind of gave my story. I gave my story why before I wouldn't vote for Trump, which I always made a joke of it. I mean, like, I could be super crass and say he's an asshole, but like, I won't do that because I know that there are many people on this call who like him. So what I'll say is that, and I talked to someone about this last night, someone who actually, who won't support Biden, wants to support Trump. Her husband's a big Trump supporter, and she's also Latino like me. For me, I think the president is the symbol of what it means to be an American. And for years before Donald Trump was even a thing, shortly after the Bush presidency or towards the end of the Bush presidency during that campaign, and certainly during the years of Obama, that's when I was covering presidential politics. I went to both presidential conventions, met with, you know, anyone who was anyone in politics. And the one thing that concerned me the most was civility in politics and unifying people. And what I really am concerned about, but I have always been concerned about, but I'm particularly concerned about, is the division in our country, the lack of political civility, and the lack of a unifying force where everyone can look at, whether you're left or right, and say, okay, this person is reflective of America, the American dream. And while I agree with some things, I disagree with other things. And, you know, Trump is never going to be that person. He's a very polarizing figure. Hillary Clinton was the same way. She was a very polarizing figure. And I think that's the challenge, is that I can't, at my core, because I feel like we need a great unifier and we need stability in political life. You know, that's just not something you're going to get from this particular person. Do you expect the upcoming debates to move the needle much? Thank you. Do you expect the political debates to move the needle much? Interestingly enough, presidential debates never really move the needle. Everyone thinks they do. I mean, they're going to be a great boon for the news companies, and they'll make some money, and they'll be really interesting TV. I'll certainly tune in. I don't think so, unless there's some moment, like an incredible moment, where it's very clear one is completely inept or ill-prepared or lacks the cognitive ability to be elected to office. I think outside of that moment, the debates aren't going to matter. I mean, I would say that, you know, if you put Joe Biden and Trump next to each other, I would suspect that Trump would be able to dominate that conversation. But Joe Biden's a tough man too, and I think he's gonna be angry and come off angry at times. And Trump is good at coming off angry as well. I think more interestingly, you know, Kamala Harris and Mike Pence, that will be a very interesting debate because you have two very formidable people, and it'll be very interesting to watch that. So it'll make for super good TV for if nothing else. Do you think the Biden campaign puts a lid on his campaign at the start of the day? No appearances, et cetera, et cetera. Will that have an impact on undecided voters? That's what's interesting because I've said that it's Trump versus Trump, right? So if it's Trump versus Trump, and you're hearing even Nancy Pelosi said this, she's like, I don't think that Joe Biden should debate Trump. Like, and she says it because we shouldn't give him the time of day kind of thing. But I think the Joe Biden campaign knows that's going to probably look worse if he doesn't do it and signal something else. I think there's a lot of people who say, you know, the best thing Joe Biden can do is just be like slow and steady and let Trump destroy himself. The challenge with that is it's really difficult to look to history at a successful presidential election where the election was only about and a referendum on the record of the person without any kind of positive, forward-looking vision of leadership for the country. The two most recent that come to mind was obviously Jimmy Carter when he was defeated when he ran for re-election against Ronald Reagan. It was certainly a referendum on Jimmy Carter, but Reagan had a vision and painted a very clear picture about why he would be a better president. Similarly, when Bush 1 was running for office, it was a referendum on Bush 1, but Bill Clinton had a very positive and thoughtful belief and vision for what his leadership as president would be. And I think that relying completely on a strategy that is, I'm not Trump, is helpful enough for the people who already hate Trump, but it's not enough to get the people in the middle on your side. And I think that's where they're going to be really, really challenging. Okay, Chris is telling me I have to go.
Yeah, I think we're going to get ready to kind of wrap up. We have one more kind of question pop in there, and that was how long you think it'll take after Election Day to get that winner. I know you mentioned it a little bit.
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, you know, God, some people, I think like there's a lot of doomsdayers who are just like, oh, we're not going to know who the president is until January, and there's going to be a court case, and there's going to be this, and there's going to be that. I mean, I don't suspect that it'll take that long. I can see 3 weeks, maybe a month, but I don't think it'll take that long. Some people are saying, oh, it's going to go until January, and then, you know, technically constitutionally, if there, isn't a president elected and the Speaker of the House, which would be Nancy Pelosi, becomes the president. I don't foresee that happening. A lot of people think that will happen or fantasize that will happen. I think that for all the criticism that's being made from both the right and the left about the post office or mail-in ballots or voting, that our system is strong enough to figure out who the winner of the election is a month after. I would hope that that would be the case. Although in some cases in California, in the last election cycle, we didn't know until probably December, mid-December. But I think that we'll know by I think we'll know by Christmas. That's the prediction I'm comfortable with.
Thanks, Brian. And I have a personal one too as well. I mean, especially with your involvement in the media, do you think the media wants Trump to win? I mean, it feels like they don't want him to lose because they're making a killing right now, right?
No. They definitely. I mean, like if you like newsrooms are like, you know, overwhelmingly Democrat and vote democratically, and that's polling data. That's not anecdotal. There's like studies on this going back forever. So I think reporters and the media as a whole hate Trump, and there's a antagonistic relationship. They hate what he stands for. And so certainly the media doesn't want Trump to win. I think that many people who are on the executive level or who look at the dollars and cents are concerned because part of the reason that some of the national newspapers have done well from digital subscriptions and ad revenues for the networks is because they're not news networks. They're Trump 24/7 networks. And as much as you love him or hate the dude, he gets ratings. People pay attention. Like even people who don't know anything about politics, they're just like Trump, whether it's love him or hate him situation. And yes, Helena, this is a Chapman shirt. I am wearing I teach a class at Chapman. and I have for 7 years.
Oh, good. She's an alumni from there too. So
Oh, awesome. Great.
that spot there. Well, I think that's going to conclude us there for the speech. Brian, thank you so much. I mean, that was some incredible insight, great detail. Thank you everyone for all those questions. That seemed to really kind of knock it up and keep the conversation flowing. Just to have a little bit of the final little piece, we want to kind of welcome some of our we want to finalize everything and welcome some of our new board members this year. Tara Bukowski is going to be joining us for our emerging professionals. Greg Coleman's offering board support, and Jan Ibe is happening with membership. If you enjoyed this presentation, please be on the lookout for others. We're always looking for additional members for that. Jan is our membership chair. If you have any questions for her, be sure to reach out. Most of our member banks are part of the institutional members, so that means that you'll just have to be an associate, which is a $75. So if you're bank as an institution member or along those, please feel free to reach out. We always are trying to grow. Aside from that, again, we want to thank you for your time here. I want to thank Brian once again for giving us that great insight. It's going to be one heck of a year and only a month away. So again, thank you all. If you'd like to learn more about RMA OC, if you're not a part of it, please check our website at rmaoc.org. Other than that, sign up for our e-blasts. Those kind of give you a preview of what's happening around the areas too. We're also kind of blending in some of the LA content and IE content. So as we're all sitting here on these digital events, you'll have great opportunities to stick in. So thanks again. We look forward to seeing you at the next event, and be safe all. Thanks.